Don't get on that train. The girl's voice cut through the station, sharp and clear, and for a split second the entire platform seemed to forget how to breathe. The announcement speakers buzzed overhead, the metallic echo of a delayed departure rattling through the high glass ceiling, but it was her voice that held the space, small but unshakable. Nia Carter stood just a few feet from the polished black shoes of Edward Hale, her yellow coat slightly oversized, sleeves hanging past her wrists, sneakers worn thin at the edges like they had carried her too far for someone her age. People turned, not because they knew her, but because something in the way she said it didn't sound like a child guessing. It sounded like certainty. Edward didn't look down right away. He was used to noise, to interruptions, to people wanting something from him. $1 billion deals had been signed in rooms louder than this. But something about the silence that followed her words pressed against him. When he finally lowered his gaze, his expression didn't change, controlled, practiced, distant. "Whose kid is this?" he asked, his voice calm, almost bored, as if she were an inconvenience that would be handled in seconds. 2 security men stepped forward immediately, hands already reaching, their movements efficient, rehearsed. Nia didn't move. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, not in fear, but like she was holding on to something invisible, something only she could feel. "Please," she said, softer now, but somehow heavier. "Don't get on that train." A ripple of laughter broke from somewhere behind them, quick, dismissive. Someone muttered, "It's just a kid." Another voice, quieter, curious. "Why would she say that?" Phones lifted, cameras catching the moment, because anything unusual near a man like Edward Hale was worth recording. He adjusted his cufflinks slowly, buying himself a second that he didn't need but took anyway. "Move her," he repeated, this time sharper, and one of the guards stepped closer, reaching for her arm. Nia finally looked up fully, her eyes locking onto his, and that was the moment something shifted, not in the crowd, but in him. Her eyes didn't match the rest of her. They weren't uncertain, weren't searching for approval or attention. They were steady, grounded, like someone who had already seen the outcome and was just trying to stop it from happening again. "If you get on that train," she said, each word careful, measured, "you won't come back." The guard's hand hovered for half a second before gripping her sleeve, but even then she didn't resist. The departure board above them flickered, letters scrambling for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. A faint crackle ran through the overhead speakers, too brief for most to notice, but loud enough to break the rhythm of the station. Edward's jaw tightened slightly. He had built an empire on reading risk, on catching the smallest inconsistency before it turned into loss, and something about this moment didn't align. It wasn't her words alone. It was the timing, the stillness, the way the crowd leaned in instead of away. "Why would you say that?" he asked, quieter now, stepping closer despite himself. The guard paused, unsure, waiting for direction. Nia's lips parted, but for a second no sound came out. Then she whispered, "Because I've seen it." The air between them felt different, heavier, like the space before a storm when everything goes still. A train horn sounded faintly in the distance, low and distant, vibrating through the rails beneath their feet. Edward glanced briefly toward the track, then back at her. "Seen what?" he pressed, his voice no longer dismissive, just controlled. Nia swallowed, her small hand lifting slightly, not pointing, not accusing, just hovering in the air between them. "The same delay. The same sound," she said, her voice trembling just enough to reveal she was still a child, still scared, but not uncertain. Behind them, the speakers crackled again, louder this time, the announcement cutting out mid-sentence. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The laughter had stopped. Edward felt it then, not fear, not yet, but a disruption in the pattern he trusted. The guard loosened his grip without realizing it. Nia took a small step back, her eyes never leaving Edward's. "It starts like this," she said, almost to herself, and for the first time, there was something else in her voice, something deeper than warning. Memory. The train lights in the distance flickered faintly against the tunnel walls, and the platform seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for something none of them could yet see. The faint vibration under the platform grew stronger, not loud enough to alarm, but enough to be felt through the soles of shoes and the metal ribs of the station, a low hum that seemed to settle into the bones of the place itself. Edward Hale did not move, but his eyes shifted again toward the dark tunnel, calculating, measuring, the way he always did when something did not follow the pattern he trusted. Around him, the crowd had lost its casual rhythm, conversations thinning into murmurs, heads turning not just toward the girl anymore, but toward the tracks, toward the unseen source of that distant sound. The guard beside Nia loosened his grip completely now, his hand hovering uncertainly at his side, as if waiting for a command that had not yet come. Nia took another small step back, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling slightly, but her gaze never breaking from Edward. "It is the same," she whispered, almost as if she was reminding herself. "The same delay, the same silence before." Edward frowned, a subtle tightening around his eyes, not fear, but recognition of something he could not yet name. He had built everything on certainty, on numbers, on outcomes that could be predicted, controlled, shaped. But this moment had none of that. It had a child in a worn coat speaking like she had already lived through what had not yet happened. "You are guessing," he said, his voice low, steady, trying to anchor the moment back into logic. "Children say things. That does not make them true." Nia shook her head immediately, more forceful this time, a strand of her hair slipping loose across her cheek. "I am not guessing," she said, her voice breaking slightly but still holding. "I remember." That word landed heavier than the others. Remember. Not think. Not feel. Remember. Edward's hand dropped from his cufflink, his fingers resting still at his side. He glanced once more toward the departure. Bored. The numbers flickered again, longer this time, the letters blurring for a full second before correcting themselves. A few people noticed now. A man in a navy coat pointed upward. A woman pulled her child a little closer without fully understanding why. The station was not panicking, not yet, but it was shifting, like a room slowly leaning off balance. "What do you remember?" Edward asked, and there was something different in his voice now, something quieter, less certain. Nia hesitated, her eyes lowering for the first time, not in submission, but as if she was looking inward, replaying something she wished she did not have to see again. Her hand rose slightly, pressing against her chest, fingers curling into the fabric of her coat. "The lights," she said slowly. "They flicker like that. People think it is nothing. They keep talking. They keep walking. And then..." She stopped. The sentence did not finish. It just hung there, unfinished but understood. A sharper crackle burst from the speakers overhead, louder than before, cutting through the air with a harsh edge that made several people flinch. The automated announcement tried to resume, but the words came out distorted, stretched, then cut off again entirely. Silence rushed in behind it, thick and sudden. Edward's eyes lifted again, scanning the platform now, not just the girl. The staff near the edge of the track exchanged glances, one of them reaching for a radio, speaking quickly under his breath. It was small, controlled, but it was not normal. Edward noticed everything that was not normal. Nia took another step back, almost blending into the crowd now, but her voice came again, softer, urgent, pulling his attention back. "Last time, no one listened either," she said. Edward looked at her sharply. "Last time?" he repeated. The words echoed slightly in the open space between them. Nia nodded, her eyes glistening now, not with panic, but with something deeper, something that had stayed with her long after it should have faded. "My mom told someone too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said something was wrong. They told her it was fine." Edward felt something tighten in his chest. Unfamiliar, unwelcome. He took a small step forward without realizing it, closing the distance that had felt so deliberate just moments ago. "And what happened?" he asked, though part of him already knew he would not like the answer. Nia looked up at him again, and this time her certainty did not come from confidence. It came from loss. "The train did not stop," she said. The sound in the tunnel grew louder, the approaching train now visible as a distant glow, its headlights flickering faintly against the curved walls. People began to shift toward the edge again, drawn by habit, by routine, by the expectation that everything would proceed as it always had. Edward stood still, caught between two forces, the life he knew built on control and reason, and the quiet, unshakable warning of a 9-year-old girl who had nothing to gain from being wrong. The air felt thinner now, tighter, like the station itself was waiting for a decision that had not yet been made. The light in the tunnel grew brighter, but it did not feel right, not steady, not smooth like it should have been. Instead, it flickered in uneven pulses that reflected across the steel rails and the polished floor, breaking into fragments of cold white that made the entire platform feel unstable, like something beneath it was shifting out of place. Edward Hale stood still, but his breathing had changed, slower, more deliberate, as if he was trying to regain control of something that was quietly slipping away from him. Around him, people stepped closer to the edge out of habit, adjusting bags, checking watches, expecting the familiar rhythm of arrival and departure to continue without interruption. A conductor farther down the platform raised a hand, signaling something to someone out of view, his voice sharp but carried away by the echo of the station. It was subtle, easy to miss, but Edward did not miss things like that. Nia did not move forward with the crowd. She moved back. One small step at a time, her sneakers sliding softly against the tile, her eyes locked on the approaching light as if it was something she had already seen too many times. Her lips parted slightly, and though she did not raise her voice, the words reached him clearly. "It is too fast." Edward's gaze snapped back to her. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tight now, no longer casual, no longer distant. Nia shook her head, her fingers pressing harder into her coat. "It does not slow down the way it should," she said. The vibration beneath their feet intensified, no longer just a hum but a tremor that moved through the platform in waves. A few people near the edge glanced down at the tracks, confusion flickering across their faces. The overhead lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging parts of the platform into brief shadow before returning, but not as bright as before. A woman near the middle of the crowd pulled her phone away from her ear, frowning. "Is something wrong?" she asked no one in particular. No one answered. Edward turned toward the edge now, his eyes narrowing, analyzing, measuring distance, speed, timing. He had spent his life reading numbers, patterns, trajectories. This was different, but not entirely beyond understanding. Something was off. He could feel it now, not just from the girl, but in the way the environment itself was behaving. "Sir?" one of his security men said quietly, stepping closer. "We should proceed. The train is arriving." Edward did not respond immediately. His gaze shifted back to Nia. She had stopped moving now, standing a few feet behind where she had been, her small figure steady despite the tension that had settled over everything. "Why are you still here?" he asked her suddenly. "If you think something is wrong, why did you not leave?" Nia blinked, surprised by the question, then lowered her eyes for a moment. "Because you are still here," she said simply. The answer landed in a way Edward did not expect. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was just honest. He exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that did not quite steady him the way it normally would. The train's headlights burst fully into view now, the shape of it emerging from the tunnel, metal reflecting light in sharp, uneven flashes. It was closer than it should have been for the speed it carried. A sharp squeal echoed from the rails, not the smooth, controlled deceleration of a normal arrival, but something strained, something resisting. People at the edge hesitated now, instinct overriding routine. A man stepped back quickly, bumping into someone behind him. The conductor shouted again, louder this time, his voice edged with urgency, though the words were still lost in the noise. Edward took one step backward. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it broke the line he had been holding. His security team reacted instantly, shifting with him, creating space, but their movements were no longer as confident as before. They were reacting, not controlling. Nia's eyes softened slightly, not with relief, but with recognition, as if she had been waiting for that exact moment. "It is happening again," she whispered, Edward looked at her sharply. Again? He repeated, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. The train roared closer, the sound filling the station now, drowning out conversation, drowning out thought. The lights above flickered rapidly, stuttering like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Edward's instincts, the ones that had built everything he owned, finally aligned with what he was seeing. This was not right. He turned fully away from the edge. "Step back," he said, not loudly, but with authority that cut through the noise. His security team moved immediately, guiding those closest to him away, creating distance. Others nearby followed, not because they understood, but because someone decisive had moved first. The space near the edge began to clear, slowly at first, then faster as more people noticed the shift. Nia watched him, her breathing uneven now, her small hands trembling slightly, but she did not look away. The train surged into the station, its motion uneven, its presence overwhelming, and for a moment everything blurred into sound and light and motion. Edward stood several feet back now, far enough to feel the difference, far enough to recognize how close he had been. He turned to Nia again, his voice lower, stripped of something it had carried before. "How did you know?" he asked. Nia hesitated, her eyes drifting past him, past the crowd, as if she was seeing something that was not there anymore. "Because last time," she said slowly, "no one stepped back." The words hung in the air, heavier than the noise around them, and for the first time since she had spoken, Edward Hale did not have an answer. The train did not glide into the station the way it was supposed to, it pushed in, heavy and uneven, the sound of metal against rail stretching longer than normal, sharper than it should have been, like something resisting the stop instead of easing into it, and the entire platform felt it, not just heard it, a deep vibration that rolled through the ground and up into the air, pressing against every chest in that space. People stepped back now without needing to be told, instinct finally catching up to what their eyes were beginning to understand, conversations gone, replaced by a quiet that was not calm but alert. Edward Hale stood still where he had moved, several feet from the edge, his shoulders squared but no longer relaxed, his eyes fixed on the train as it slowed in irregular pulses, not one smooth motion but a sequence of corrections, adjustments, something trying to stabilize itself. The doors did not open immediately. That alone was enough to shift the mood again. A man near the front let out a nervous laugh that died quickly when no one responded. The overhead lights flickered once more, longer this time, leaving the platform dim for a full second before returning with a duller glow, as if something had drained them. Edward turned his head slightly, just enough to look back at Nia. She had not moved closer. She stood where she had stopped, her small frame still, her breathing visible now in the rise and fall of her shoulders, her eyes locked on the train with a familiarity that did not belong to a child. "It should have stopped already," she said quietly. Edward followed her gaze again. She was right. The train had come to a halt, but not cleanly, not confidently. It felt like a pause rather than a finish, like something unfinished lingered beneath it. A conductor stepped out from the first car, his movements quick, his eyes scanning the platform in a way that was meant to reassure but did not quite succeed. He spoke into his radio again, words too low to catch, but the urgency in his posture was clear now. A few passengers inside the train could be seen through the windows, their faces turned outward, some confused, some already uneasy, as if they had felt the same irregular motion from within. Edward's security team hovered closer now, not crowding him, but no longer relaxed, their attention split between the train and the surrounding crowd. "Sir," one of them said carefully, "we can take another route." Edward did not answer immediately. His attention was no longer just on the train. It was on the sequence of events, the pattern that had formed in the last few minutes, the warning, the delay, the flickering lights, the uneven arrival. He looked back at Nia again, and this time there was no dismissal in his expression, only a quiet calculation that had shifted into something else, something closer to acknowledgement. "What happens next?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried weight, because it meant he was no longer rejecting what she had said. Nia hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly against her coat. "Sometimes nothing," she said, her voice uncertain for the first time. Sometimes people still get on, and everything seems normal. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. And the other times? He pressed. Nia swallowed, her gaze drifting briefly toward the train doors, still closed, still waiting. Something small first, she said slowly. Something people ignore. The words barely left her mouth before it happened. A sharp pop echoed from somewhere along the length of the train, not loud enough to cause panic, but loud enough to break the fragile stillness that had settled over the platform. Several heads turned at once. The conductor froze mid-step, his hand tightening around the radio. Inside the train, a few passengers stood up suddenly, their movements visible through the windows, uncertain, searching for information that had not yet been given. Edward felt the shift immediately. It was not chaos. Not yet. But it was the exact kind of small disruption that grew when ignored. He exhaled slowly, a breath that felt heavier than it should have, and made a decision without announcing it. He took another step. Back. His security followed instantly, widening the distance between him and the train, guiding those nearest to him with subtle gestures that others began to mirror. The space near the edge opened further, the invisible line moving backward as more people followed the movement without fully understanding why. Nia watched him, her expression softening just slightly, not in relief, but in recognition of something aligning the way it should have earlier. "That is how it starts," she said, her voice barely above the hum that still lingered in the air. Edward looked at her, really looked this time, not at her clothes or her size or the assumption of who she was, but at the steadiness that had held from the moment she spoke. "And how does it end?" he asked quietly. Nia did not answer right away. Her eyes moved past him again, towards something only she seemed to see, her face tightening with a memory that had not faded. The train doors finally slid open with a delayed hiss, slower than usual, revealing a dim interior and a few hesitant passengers stepping out, their expressions uncertain. The platform remained quieter than it should have been. Nia finally spoke, her voice softer than before, but heavier. "Last time," she said. "No one asked that question?" The air between them held that sentence like something fragile, something that could still change depending on what came next, and Edward Hale stood there, no longer a man rushing toward a schedule, but someone who had stopped long enough to realize he might not have been meant to arrive at all. The platform did not return to normal after the doors opened, even though that was what everyone expected, what everyone was waiting for, that quiet signal that everything had corrected itself and the moment had passed. But it did not come. The air stayed tight, the kind of tight that made people hesitate before stepping forward, like their instincts were holding them back even when their routines told them to move. A few passengers stepped off the train slowly, their movements cautious, their eyes scanning the platform as if they were trying to understand why it felt different, why something invisible had shifted. Inside the cars, others remained seated, not rushing out the way they usually would, not reaching for their bags with that familiar impatience. Edward Hale noticed all of it, every hesitation, every delayed reaction, every detail that did not align with what he knew to be normal. He had spent his entire life reading rooms, predicting behavior, controlling outcomes, but this was something else, something that did not follow the rules he trusted. He looked at the open train doors, then back at Nia, and for the first time there was no distance in his gaze, no separation of status or assumption, just a quiet recognition that she had seen something he had not. "You said something small comes first," he said, his voice low, steady, but no longer dismissive. "That was it?" Nia shook her head slowly, her eyes still fixed on the train. "No," she said. "That is just the part people notice." Edward felt that sentence settle into him, heavier than it should have been. He turned again toward the train, watching as one of the conductors stepped down onto the platform, speaking quickly into his radio, his posture tighter now, more alert, no longer pretending everything was routine. A second conductor appeared at another door, glancing up toward the overhead lights as they flickered again, briefly dimming the entire platform before returning with that same uneven glow. The passengers who had stepped off the train were not moving away quickly. They lingered, confused, uncertain, looking back toward the cars they had just left, as if something about them did not feel right anymore. Edward took another step back, then another, creating more distance without thinking about it, and the people nearest him followed again, not because they understood why, but because his movement had become a signal, a quiet command that something needed space. Nia watched him, her expression soft but focused, her small hands now still at her sides, no longer trembling, as if the moment had shifted from warning to waiting. "What happens after the small part?" Edward asked. Nia hesitated, her eyes lowering briefly, then lifting again with that same quiet certainty. "People decide if they are going to listen," she said. Edward glanced around the platform, taking in the faces, the confusion, the hesitation, the way some people were already stepping farther back while others still stood near the doors, unsure, caught between instinct and routine. He understood that moment. He had built entire companies on that moment, the space where a decision either prevented loss or created it. A man near the train took a step forward, peering inside one of the cars, then stepped back again quickly, shaking his head as if he had seen something he did not expect. Another passenger exited, moving faster this time, pulling a small suitcase behind her, her expression tight, her pace quicker than necessary. The conductor's voice rose slightly, still not loud enough to cause panic, but no longer calm, no longer controlled. Edward's jaw tightened. This was no longer uncertainty. This was a pattern forming. He turned fully toward his security team. "We are not boarding," he said, the decision clear, final, and immediate. They nodded without question, shifting their positions, creating a wider buffer around him, but also subtly guiding others away from the train's immediate edge. The movement spread again, a ripple through the crowd, more people stepping back, more space opening where there had been expectation just minutes before. Nia exhaled slowly, a breath she had been holding since the moment she spoke, but her eyes did not relax. They stayed fixed on the train, on the open doors, on the people still deciding. "It is not over yet," she said quietly. Edward looked at her again. "What else is there?" he asked. Nia's gaze did not move. "The part where people think they are safe," she answered. The words settled into the space between them just as another sharp flicker ran through the lights, longer this time, leaving the platform dim for nearly 2 full seconds before returning. When the light came back, it felt weaker, like something had been drained from it. A low sound came from beneath the train, not loud, not alarming, but wrong, like something under strain. A few more passengers stepped away quickly now, their pace faster, their expressions no longer confused but uneasy. Edward felt it clearly now, not just as observation, but as certainty. This was not a moment to question. This was a moment to act. He took another step back, farther than before, and this time he did not stop to measure it. He simply moved. And for the first time in years, the man who controlled everything chose to follow the warning of a 9-year-old girl instead of his own plan, and in that quiet decision, something unseen began to change. The distance between the crowd and the train widened, not all at once, but in subtle shifts, small steps that accumulated into space, the kind of space that only appears when people begin to trust something they cannot fully explain. Edward Hale felt it happening around him, the invisible line moving farther from the edge, the quiet instinct spreading from one person to another without words. His security team adjusted with precision, guiding movement without force, their hands open, their gestures calm, but there was something different in them now too, something less certain, something that mirrored the unease settling over the platform. The train doors remained open, but fewer people were stepping inside. Those who had planned to board hesitated, pausing just long enough for doubt to take hold. A man in a gray jacket stood at the threshold of one car, one foot inside, one foot still on the platform, frozen in that in-between moment where a decision had not yet been made. He looked over his shoulder, not at anyone specific, just searching for a signal, for confirmation that everything was fine. No one gave it. Nia watched him quietly, her small frame steady, her eyes following each movement like she was tracing a pattern she already knew by heart. "This is the part where they still choose," she said softly. Edward turned to her, the words settling deeper now, no longer abstract, no longer distant. Choose what? He asked. Nia did not answer right away. Her gaze shifted across the platform, over the faces, the hesitation, the uncertainty that had replaced routine. To believe what they see, she said finally, or to ignore it. Edward followed her line of sight. He saw the same things now, the flickering lights, the delayed responses, the staff speaking into radios more frequently, the passengers stepping back faster than before. He saw the pattern, and more importantly, he recognized the cost of ignoring it. The man at the train door stepped back onto the platform completely, pulling his foot away like he had just realized something was wrong, too late to explain. He did not speak. He just moved away, his pace quickening, his expression tightening as he joined the growing space behind the invisible line. That movement changed something. Others noticed. A woman who had been waiting with a suitcase turned around without boarding. Another person followed. Then another. The flow reversed, slowly at first, then with more certainty. Edward felt it as a shift in control, not his control, but the control of the moment itself. It was no longer moving toward the train. It was moving away from it. The conductor's voice rose again, louder this time, attempting to restore order, to maintain the routine that had been disrupted, but the words did not carry the authority they needed. They sounded strained, uncertain, like they were trying to convince as much as instruct. Nia's eyes softened slightly as she watched the change unfold. It did not happen like this before, she said, almost to herself. Edward caught the difference immediately. Before? He asked. Nia nodded slowly. People kept going, she said. They thought everything would be fine because it always is. Edward exhaled, a slow, controlled breath that felt different now, less about maintaining composure and more about accepting what he had not seen earlier. He looked back at the train again. The open doors, the dim interior, the passengers still inside who had not moved yet, who were still sitting, still waiting, still trusting the system they believed would protect them. And this time? He asked. Nia looked at him again, and for the first time there was a faint hint of something lighter in her expression, not relief, not yet, but possibility. This time, someone listened, she said. The words were simple, but they carried weight, because they were not about her. They were about him. Edward felt it clearly now, the quiet realization. Settling in? He had not just stepped back. Others had followed. The pattern had changed because of that one decision. A low sound came again from beneath the train, longer this time, more noticeable, and now more people reacted to it, stepping back faster, creating even more distance. The platform that had once been crowded near the edge was now open, the space wide, the air easier to move through. The train remained where it was still, but not calm, not settled, like something unresolved lingered beneath its surface. Edward turned to his security again. Keep people back, he said, his voice firm now, clear, no hesitation. They nodded, moving with purpose, extending the space, guiding those who lingered too close, not with urgency, but with quiet insistence. Nia watched him, her small hands finally relaxing at her sides. You changed it, she said softly. Edward looked down at her, and for the first time since she had spoken, there was no question in his expression, no doubt, only acknowledgement. No, he said quietly. You did. Nia shook her head gently. I just said it, she replied. Edward's gaze returned to the train one more time, the flickering lights reflecting off its metal surface, the open doors still waiting for a decision that fewer and fewer people were willing to make. And in that moment, standing several feet back from where he had once been ready to step forward without hesitation, Edward Hale understood something he had not built his life on, something he had not valued until now, that sometimes the smallest voice in the room was the one that saw the truth first, and sometimes the only difference between what happens and what does not is whether someone chooses to listen. The platform no longer felt like a place of departure, it felt like a place holding its breath, suspended between what should have happened and what might still unfold, and that tension settled into every movement, every glance, every quiet decision made without words. The train stood with its doors open, but it no longer invited anyone in, it waited, heavy and uncertain, like it was no longer fully in control of itself. Edward Hale remained where he was, several feet back from the edge, but his attention had shifted beyond observation now. It had moved into responsibility, into awareness of the fact that what happened next would not just be something he witnessed, but something he influenced. Around him, the crowd had formed a loose boundary, not organized, not directed, but clear, a shared instinct that had spread from one person to another until it became a silent agreement. Nia stood just behind that line, her small figure still, her eyes scanning the train not with fear but with careful attention, as if she was waiting for something specific, something she had not yet seen. "It should be stopping completely by now," she said quietly. Edward followed her gaze again, noticing how the train seemed to settle, then shift again slightly, not moving forward, not moving back, but adjusting in a way that felt unnatural, like a machine trying to correct something it could not fully fix. A conductor stepped down from another car, his voice sharper now as he spoke into his radio, his posture no longer composed but tense, his movements quick and deliberate. A second staff member appeared farther down, walking faster than before, scanning the length of the train with a look that was no longer routine. Edward caught that immediately. Systems fail quietly before they fail loudly. He had seen that pattern before, just not here, not like this. "You said something small comes first," he said, his voice low, focused. "We saw that. What comes after that?" Nia did not answer right away. Her eyes shifted slowly along the train, from one car to the next, as if she was searching for a detail that would confirm something she already believed. "The part where it tries to keep going," she said finally. Edward's brow tightened slightly. "It is not moving," he replied. Nia shook her head. "Not forward," she said. "But it is not settled either." Edward looked again, really looked this time, not just at the stillness, but at the subtle inconsistencies beneath it. The slight vibration that had not disappeared, the faint sound beneath the metal that continued even after the train had come to a stop, the way the lights inside flickered unevenly, not in sync, not stable. He felt it then, that quiet confirmation that what she was describing was already happening. A passenger near one of the open doors suddenly stepped back quickly, his hand lifting instinctively as if to steady himself, though nothing visible had pushed him. Another person inside turned their head sharply, looking down toward the floor of the train, confusion crossing their face. The movement spread again, small at first, then more noticeable, like ripples forming in still water. Edward's jaw tightened. "Everyone back," he said, not loudly, but with a clarity that cut through the tension. His security moved immediately, their presence reinforcing the command, guiding people farther from the edge, widening the space even more. This time, there was less hesitation. The crowd responded faster, stepping back, creating distance without questioning why. Nia watched him, her expression steady, but her breathing had quickened slightly, the rise and fall of her shoulders more visible now. "This is where it changes," she said. Edward glanced at her. "Changes how?" he asked. Nia's eyes softened for a moment, not with relief, but with something like hope. "Before no one moved back this far," she said. Edward looked around at the space that had formed, the clear gap between the crowd and the train, the absence of people at the edge where there should have been dozens just minutes ago. He understood then that the difference was not in what the train was doing. It was in how people were responding. The conductor's voice rose again, louder now, urgency no longer hidden, calling for attention, for assistance, for something that was not part of the normal routine. The sound beneath the train grew slightly, still low, still controlled, but no longer ignorable. Edward felt it through the ground again, a steady vibration that did not belong to a train that had already stopped. He took another step back without thinking, and this time he reached out slightly, a small gesture, but enough to guide Nia farther with him. She moved without resistance, her small hand brushing briefly against his sleeve, grounding, real. He did not pull away. "You stay," he said quietly, almost to himself. Nia looked up at him. "I said I would," she replied. Edward exhaled slowly, the weight of that simple statement settling into him in a way that no business decision ever had. Around them, the platform had transformed completely, no longer a place of routine movement, but a space defined by awareness, by caution, by a collective decision to pause instead of proceed. The train remained where it was, but the power of it, the pull it had just minutes ago, was gone. It no longer controlled the moment. And standing there, no longer at the front but among everyone else who had chosen to step back, Edward Hale understood something that could not be measured, could not be calculated, that sometimes the outcome is not changed by force or authority, but by a single moment where someone decides not to ignore what does not feel right, and in that decision, everything begins to shift. The platform had fully shifted now, not in noise, not in chaos, but in something quieter and more powerful, awareness, the kind that spreads without announcement, without permission, until everyone feels it at once. The train remained where it was, its doors still open, its lights still flickering in uneven rhythms, but it no longer felt like something people were meant to approach, it felt like something to be watched, something to be understood before any step was taken. Edward Hale stood with that awareness settling deeper into him, no longer analyzing from a distance, but standing inside the moment itself, feeling the consequences of action and inaction unfold in real time. His gaze moved across the platform, taking in the widened space, the subtle retreat of the crowd, the way even the smallest movements now carried intention. No one laughed anymore. No one dismissed what had happened as coincidence. The pattern had become too clear. Nia stood beside him, slightly behind, her small frame still grounded, her eyes fixed on the train with a quiet focus that had not faded since the beginning. "This is where it decides," she said softly. Edward turned his head slightly. "Decides what?" he asked. Nia did not look at him when she answered. "If it is going to stop being just a warning," she said. The words landed with a weight that did not need explanation. Edward looked back at the train, and for the first time, he did not just see a machine or a schedule, he saw something unstable, something unresolved, something that had not yet reached its final state. The faint vibration beneath the platform had not stopped. It had changed, slowed, but not disappeared, like a heartbeat that had not settled into a normal rhythm. A conductor moved quickly along the length of the train now, speaking into his radio with urgency that could no longer be hidden. Another staff member appeared at the far end of the platform, gesturing to someone out of sight, their movements sharp, coordinated, but not rehearsed. This was not routine anymore. Edward noticed how the passengers inside the train were no longer sitting still. Some stood, some moved toward the doors, others remained frozen in place, uncertain, waiting for direction that had not yet come. A woman stepped off quickly, her face tense, her eyes scanning the platform as if searching for confirmation that stepping away had been the right decision. She did not go far. She stopped several feet back, joining the invisible line that had formed, her posture still alert, still unsure. "Why do some people stay?" Edward asked quietly. Nia's eyes softened slightly, but she did not look away from the train. "Because they think it cannot happen twice," she said. Edward felt that sentence settle into him, not as a concept, but as something familiar, something he had seen in other forms, in business, in decisions, in risk. The belief that something will not repeat itself simply because it should not. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady but heavier than before. "And you think it can?" he asked. Nia nodded once. "Not the same way," she said. "But close enough." The lights flickered again, longer this time, leaving the platform dim for nearly 3 seconds before returning, and when they did, the glow felt weaker, uneven, like something had been drained from it. A low sound followed, deeper now, more noticeable, a vibration that traveled through the ground and up into the air, causing a few people to shift. Instinctively, stepping back another inch, another foot, without needing to be told. Edward's eyes moved sharply toward the base of the train, his focus narrowing, his instincts fully engaged now. This was no longer a possibility. This was a pattern continuing. He turned slightly, addressing his security with a quiet firmness that carried more weight than volume. "No one goes near it," he said. They nodded immediately, spreading out, reinforcing the space, their presence calm but unyielding. The crowd responded again, the line moving back just a little more, the distance growing, the awareness deepening. Nia watched the movement, her expression unchanged, but her breathing steadier now, as if something she had been waiting for was finally happening the way it should have before. "It is different this time," she said. Edward looked at her. "Because people stepped back?" he asked. Nia shook her head gently. "Because someone listened before it was too late," she said. The words lingered between them, quiet but undeniable. Edward turned back to the train, watching as another passenger stepped out quickly, then another, their movements faster now, more urgent, but still controlled. No panic. Just realization. The conductor's voice rose again, clearer now, calling for attention, for space, for caution, and this time, people listened without hesitation. The platform, once crowded with expectation, had become a place of distance, of observation, of choice. Edward felt it clearly now, this shift from reaction to prevention, from waiting to acting. He glanced at Nia again, and for the first time, there was something like respect in his expression, not spoken, not announced, but present. She had seen it before anyone else. She had said it when no one believed her. And now, standing in a moment that could have gone differently, he understood that the difference was not chance. It was a voice that refused to stay silent, and a decision to hear it when it mattered most, and as the low vibration continued beneath the train, no longer hidden, no longer subtle, the entire platform stood in that awareness, waiting not for what would happen, but for what had already begun to change. The platform no longer waited for instruction, it moved with a quiet, collective understanding, the kind that forms when uncertainty becomes too real to ignore, and every person present could feel it now, not just as a thought, but as something physical in the air, pressing against their instincts, guiding their choices without needing explanation. The train remained still, but not settled, not at rest, the faint vibration beneath it continuing like a signal that had not yet resolved, a message repeating itself in a language only a few had learned to hear. Edward Hale stood with that awareness fully formed now, no longer questioning whether something was wrong, but recognizing that the moment had already shifted beyond doubt. His gaze moved along the length of the train again, slower this time, more deliberate, taking in every inconsistency, every movement that confirmed what had been unfolding since the girl first spoke. The doors remained open, but now they felt like an exit, not an entrance, and more passengers were stepping out, not rushing, not panicking, but choosing distance with a quiet urgency that did not need to be spoken. Nia stood beside him, her small figure steady, her eyes following the same line, watching as the pattern continued to reveal itself piece by piece. "This is where it becomes clear," she said softly. Edward turned slightly. "Clear to who?" he asked. Nia's gaze did not leave the train. "To the ones who are willing to see it," she replied. The answer settled between them, simple but precise, and Edward understood it immediately. Not everyone would see it. Not everyone would choose to. He had seen that before in different forms, in different rooms, where truth was present but ignored because it was inconvenient. But here, now, the cost of ignoring it was no longer abstract. It was immediate. A sharper sound echoed from beneath one of the cars, not loud, not explosive, but distinct enough to draw attention, a metallic shift that did not belong to something stable. Several heads turned at once. A man near the far end of the platform raised his voice, asking if everything was all right, his tone uncertain, searching for reassurance that no one could honestly give. The conductor responded quickly, his voice louder now, calling for space, for caution, for people to step back further, and this time the authority carried, not because of his role, but because it matched what everyone was already feeling. Edward noticed how quickly the line moved again, the invisible boundary widening as more people stepped back, creating a buffer that had not existed minutes ago. His security team reinforced it, their presence calm but firm, guiding without force, ensuring that no one drifted too close out of curiosity or habit. The platform had transformed completely, no longer reactive, but proactive, no longer waiting for confirmation, but responding to what had already been revealed. Nia's breathing had steadied, her shoulders no longer rising as sharply, but her eyes remained focused, alert, tracking every change with the same quiet intensity. "It is not just the train," she said. Edward looked at her. "What do you mean?" he asked. Nia's gaze shifted briefly upward, toward the overhead lights, then back to the train. "Everything around it," she said. Edward followed her glance, noticing the flicker again, the uneven rhythm of the lights, the way they dimmed slightly before returning, not fully stable, not fully reliable. He listened more carefully, hearing the layered sounds now, not just the train, but the systems around it, the hum, the crackle, the subtle disruptions that had been easy to ignore at first but now stood out clearly. It was all connected. It was all part of the same pattern. A woman who had stepped off earlier moved farther back again, pulling a young boy gently with her, her hand firm but not rushed, her expression focused, protective. Others mirrored the movement, the distance increasing, the space becoming safer not by accident, but by choice. Edward felt the weight of that realization settle deeper. This was not about one moment. It was about a sequence, a chain that could either continue or be broken depending on what people did next. He turned to Nia again, his voice quieter now, more measured. "And after this?" he asked. Nia hesitated, her eyes lowering for a brief second, then lifting again with that same clarity that had been there from the start. "After this is the part that cannot be undone," she said. The words did not need elaboration. Edward understood. This was the threshold. The moment where action mattered more than awareness. He looked back at the train, at the open doors, at the passengers still inside who had not yet moved, who were still deciding, still balancing routine against instinct. He felt a shift inside himself then, not dramatic, not sudden, but decisive. He stepped forward slightly, not toward the train, but toward the edge of the safe space, his presence visible, his posture clear. "Everyone back," he said again, louder this time, his voice carrying across the platform, not forceful, but undeniable. Heads turned. People listened. The movement responded. The line moved again. Nia watched him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes reflecting something new, something that had not been there before. Not just recognition. Validation. The train remained where it was, the vibrations still present, the system still unsettled, but the environment around it had changed completely. It was no longer a place of unthinking movement. It was a place of awareness, of choice, of intervention. And standing there, no longer reacting, but shaping what came next, Edward Hale realized that the truth had not shocked everyone because of what it revealed, but because of how close they had come to ignoring it, and how different everything looked once they finally chose not to. The moment stretched longer than it should have, the kind of moment that usually passes unnoticed, but here it held, suspended between action and consequence, and everyone on that platform could feel it, not as panic, but as a quiet understanding that something irreversible was approaching. The train remained still, but the stillness was no longer neutral, it carried tension, like a held breath that had gone on too long. Edward Hale stood at the edge of the space he had helped create, his posture steady, his presence no longer detached, but fully engaged in what was unfolding. His voice had already shifted the crowd once, and now the platform responded to him. Without hesitation, people stepping back further, creating a wide, clear buffer that separated them from the train by several yards. The distance felt intentional now, deliberate, not just a reaction, but a decision shared by everyone present. Nia stood beside him, her small hand resting lightly against her coat, her eyes still locked on the train with the same quiet focus that had never wavered. "This is where it shows itself," she said softly. Edward did not look at her immediately. His attention was fixed on the train, on the subtle details that were no longer subtle at all. "What shows itself?" he asked. Nia's voice was calm, but there was a weight in it that had not been there before. "The part that cannot stay hidden anymore," she said. As if responding to her words, the low vibration beneath the train shifted again, deeper now, more pronounced, a steady pulse that could be felt through the soles of shoes and up into the chest. The overhead lights flickered once more, but this time they did not return immediately. For a full 4 seconds the platform dimmed into a muted gray, the kind of dimness that stripped away comfort and replaced it with clarity. When the lights came back, they did so unevenly, sections of the platform brighter than others, shadows lingering where they should not. A murmur moved through the crowd, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. People were no longer questioning if something was wrong. They were acknowledging it. A conductor near the middle of the train stepped back quickly, his hand lifting from the side of the car as if he had felt something through it, something unexpected. He spoke sharply into his radio, his voice no longer controlled, no longer measured, but urgent. Another staff member appeared at the far end, moving quickly, signaling to others, their coordination tighter now, faster, but clearly reactive, not planned. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly, his instincts fully aligned with what he was seeing. This was escalation. Not sudden, not explosive, but undeniable. He turned slightly, addressing his security with a clarity that carried across the space. "No one moves forward," he said. "Keep the line." They responded. Immediately, spreading out, reinforcing the boundary, their presence firm, their movements precise. The crowd followed again, stepping back another foot, another yard, the space widening into something that now felt like protection. Nia watched the shift, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, but her eyes softened for just a moment, as if something she had been waiting for had finally happened. "It did not get this far last time," she said quietly. Edward turned to her. "What stopped it before?" he asked. Nia hesitated, her gaze lowering briefly, then lifting again with that same quiet certainty. "Nothing," she said. The word hung in the air, heavier than anything else she had said. Edward felt it settle into him, not as information, but as realization. There had been no intervention. No one had stepped back. No one had listened. The pattern had continued without resistance. He looked back at the train, at the open doors, at the passengers still inside who were now moving more quickly, stepping out, creating distance, their expressions no longer uncertain, but resolved. They were choosing to leave. They were choosing space. A low sound rose again from beneath the train, longer this time, more consistent, no longer a brief anomaly, but a sustained signal that something was not functioning as it should. The platform seemed to absorb it, the air tightening, the awareness sharpening. Edward took another step back, not out of fear, but out of understanding, and the movement spread again, the lines shifting farther, the distance increasing. He glanced at Nia, and for the first time, there was something like gratitude in his expression, not spoken, not formal, but real. "You saw this before anyone else," he said. Nia shook her head gently. "I just remembered," she replied. Edward looked back at the train, the flickering lights reflecting across its surface, the open doors now nearly empty as more passengers stepped away. The platform had changed completely, from a place of routine to a place of awareness, from movement to stillness, from assumption to decision. And standing there, in a moment that could have unfolded very differently, Edward Hale understood that. What was happening now was not just the result of a warning, but the result of a choice, the choice to stop, to listen, to step back before the moment passed beyond control, and as the low vibration continued beneath the train, steady and unresolved, the entire platform stood ready, not waiting for what would happen, but prepared for what had already begun to reveal itself. The platform held steady in a way it had not before, not because everything was fixed, but because everyone had finally aligned with the truth unfolding in front of them, and that alignment changed the atmosphere more than any announcement ever could. The train remained in place, its doors still open, but now almost no one stood near them, the last few passengers stepping away with quiet urgency, their movements controlled but decisive, as if they had crossed an invisible line inside themselves and could not step back across it again. Edward Hale stood several yards from the edge now, his posture firm, his presence no longer that of a man passing through, but of someone holding the moment together. His eyes moved across the platform, tracking every shift, every response, every sign that confirmed what had already become undeniable. The low vibration beneath the train had not stopped, It had deepened, settled into a constant rhythm that could be felt without effort, like a pulse that refused to fade. Nia stood beside him, her small figure steady, her gaze fixed on the train with the same quiet certainty that had carried from the first word she spoke. "This is where it changes everything," she said softly. Edward turned his head slightly. "How?" he asked. Nia did not hesitate this time. "Because now people are not waiting anymore," she said. Edward followed her gaze again, seeing it clearly, the difference between hesitation and decision, between standing still and choosing to move away. The platform had become something else entirely, not reactive, but aware, not uncertain, but deliberate. A conductor moved quickly along the train, his voice raised as he spoke into his radio, no longer attempting to maintain normalcy, but actively calling for assistance, for shutdown, for intervention. Another staff member appeared with him, their movements coordinated now, urgent, focused, responding to something that could no longer be ignored. The overhead lights flickered again, shorter this time, but sharper, like a signal that was no longer trying to hide. A few people flinched, stepping back another foot, tightening the space even further. Edward felt the shift not just in the environment, but inside himself, the transition from observation to responsibility fully complete. He was no longer part of the crowd. He was part of the outcome. He took a slow breath, steadying not his fear, but his focus, and turned slightly to his security. "Clear the immediate area," he said, his voice calm but absolute. They moved without hesitation, extending the boundary, guiding the last few individuals away from the train's proximity, ensuring that the space was not just wide, but safe. The movement spread outward, the platform opening even more, the distance now measured not in steps, but in intention. Nia watched the expansion of space, her expression unchanged, but her eyes reflecting something deeper now, something like quiet confirmation. "It is not supposed to reach this point," she said. Edward looked at her. "What point?" he asked. Nia's gaze shifted briefly toward the train, then back to him. "The point where it is too late to stop," she said. The words settled into the air, heavier than anything before, because they carried finality, a boundary that once crossed could not be undone. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly, his attention sharpening further. He looked back at the train, noticing now that the staff were no longer just communicating, they were acting, moving with urgency, signaling to each other, attempting to control something that had already moved beyond routine. The low sound beneath the train intensified again, not louder, but more consistent, more present, like a signal that had reached a steady state. It was no longer intermittent. It was continuous. A few remaining passengers stepped off quickly now, their pace faster, their expressions focused, no longer questioning, no longer uncertain. They moved away from the train without looking back. Edward felt the significance of that moment settle into him. This was the threshold Nia had been describing. Not the beginning. Not the warning. The point where action defined the outcome. He glanced at her again. "And we are before that?" he asked quietly. Nia looked at him, and for the first time, there was a slight softness in her expression, not relief, but something close to it. "Yes," she said. Edward exhaled slowly, a breath that carried weight, understanding, and something else, something he did not often allow himself to feel, humility. He turned back toward the platform, raising his voice just enough to carry, not loud, but clear. "Everyone stay back," he said. "Do not approach the train." This time, there was no hesitation at all. The crowd responded instantly, stepping back further, reinforcing the space, the decision shared by everyone now, not guided by confusion, but by clarity. The platform stood still, wide, open, aware, and the train, once the center of movement, had become the center of caution. Nia stood beside him, her small presence unchanged, but now understood, not as an interruption, not as a child speaking out of turn, but as the one who had seen what others had missed. And in that moment, as the vibration continued beneath the train and the staff worked with urgency to contain what could no longer be ignored, Edward Hale realized that the difference between what happened before and what was happening now was not the train, not the system, not the timing, but a single voice that refused to be silent, and a single decision to listen before the moment passed beyond reach. The platform had reached a point where silence carried more meaning than noise, where every movement was intentional, and every person present understood, without needing to be told, that something critical had already shifted beyond routine control. The train remained in place, but it no longer felt like a machine waiting to depart. It felt like a system being held in suspension, something that had been caught just before crossing a line that could not be reversed. Edward Hale stood at the front of the widened space, his posture grounded, his presence no longer about authority, but about steadiness, about holding the moment where it needed to stay. His eyes moved across the platform, taking in the staff now moving with urgency, the radios pressed close to their mouths, the signals exchanged quickly, efficiently, but with a tension that made it clear this was no longer a normal situation. The low vibration beneath the train continued steady, present, but it no longer carried the same uncertainty it had before. Now it was understood. Now it was being addressed. Nia stood beside him, her small figure still, her breathing even, her eyes watching the train not with fear, but with a quiet calm that had slowly replaced the tension she had carried since the beginning. "This is the part where it stops," she said softly. Edward turned to her, not questioning, not challenging, but listening. "Because we stepped back?" he asked. Nia shook her head gently. "Because it was seen," she replied. The words settled into the space between them, simple, but profound in a way that did not need explanation. Edward looked back at the train again, noticing how the staff had begun to move differently now, not reacting, but controlling, guiding the situation toward resolution. One of the conductors signaled firmly, directing the remaining passengers to move farther away, his voice clear, authoritative, no longer strained. Another staff member positioned themselves near the base of the train, not touching it, but observing closely, communicating continuously through the radio. The overhead lights flickered once more, but this time they returned stronger, more stable, as if the system itself was correcting, aligning, settling back into a controlled state. The crowd remained where they were, no one pushing forward, no one testing the boundary that had been created. The space held, wide and deliberate, a quiet testament to the decisions that had been made just minutes earlier. Edward felt the shift clearly now, not just in the environment, but within himself. The urgency had not disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer about reacting to what might happen. It was about recognizing that what could have happened had been prevented. He glanced at Nia again, his expression softer now, the sharp edge of control replaced by something more human, something more grounded. "You knew it would stop?" he asked. Nia looked at him, her eyes steady, her voice calm. "I hoped," she said. Edward exhaled slowly, a breath that carried both relief and understanding. Hope had not been part of his calculations before. It had not been something he relied on. But standing here, in a moment shaped by something he could not measure, he understood its place. The low vibration beneath the train began to fade, gradually, not abruptly, the pulse slowing, softening, until it was no longer felt. The platform seemed to release a breath it had been holding, the tension easing, not disappearing completely, but settling into something manageable, something resolved. A final announcement came through the speakers, this time clear, steady, instructing passengers to remain off the train until further notice, the voice calm, controlled, aligned with what had already been understood. No one questioned it. No one resisted. They simply remained where they were, respecting the space that had been created. Edward stood still for a moment longer, watching as the staff continued their work, ensuring that everything was secure, that the system was stable, that the moment had passed fully. Then he turned back to Nia, his gaze steady, present. "You stay," he said quietly. Nia nodded once. "I said I would," she replied. Edward looked at her, really looked this time, not as someone passing through his world, but as someone who had changed it, even if only for a moment. "You did more than that," he said. Nia shook her head slightly, her small hands resting at her sides. "I just told the truth," she said. Edward felt the weight of that statement settle into him, not as something abstract, but as something real, something that had shaped the outcome of everything that had just happened. He looked back at the train one last time, the doors now closed, the lights steady, the system returning to normal, but not the same normal it had been before. Something had changed. Something had been seen. And that made all the difference. The platform remained quiet. Not empty, but calm, the kind of calm that comes after a moment that could have gone another way, and as Edward Hale stood there beside a 9-year-old girl who had refused to stay silent, he understood that sometimes the most important shift does not happen in the system itself, but in the moment someone chooses to listen before it is too late. The station did not return to what it had been before, even as the lights stabilized and the low vibration faded into silence, because something deeper had shifted, something that could not be undone or unseen. The train stood quiet now, no longer flickering, no longer resisting, its presence reduced from something uncertain to something contained, managed, understood. Staff moved with calmer steps, radios lowered, voices steady again, but there was a difference in how they looked at it, not as routine equipment, but as something that had almost become more. The platform remained open, wide, respectful of the space that had been created, as if no one wanted to erase the distance too quickly. Edward Hale stood there a moment longer, not moving, not speaking, just breathing in the stillness that followed what could have been something else entirely. Around him, people slowly began to talk again, but their voices were quieter, more thoughtful, not the casual noise from before, but something softer, like they were aware they had all just stood at the edge of something they did not fully understand. Nia shifted slightly beside him, her small shoes making a faint sound against the floor, and for the first time since she had spoken, she looked away from the train. Her eyes moved across the platform, taking in the people, the space, the calm that had returned, and then she exhaled, a breath that felt like it had been waiting for a long time. Edward noticed it immediately. "It is over?" he asked quietly. Nia nodded once, her expression calm, but not empty, not distant, just settled. "This part is?" she said. Edward looked at her, the words staying with him, not as an ending, but as something that acknowledged there had been a beginning, a middle, and now a pause. He glanced back at the train one last time, then back to her. "You saved a lot of people today," he said. Nia shook her head gently, almost instinctively. "I just did not stay quiet," she replied. Edward let that sit in the air between them, understanding it in a way he had not before. He had spent his life making decisions that moved markets, changed outcomes, built structures that others relied on, but none of that had required what she had done, the simple, unfiltered choice to speak when no one expected it, to stand when no one asked her to. A staff member approached from a distance, slowing as he recognized Edward, then stopping a few feet away, his posture respectful but his expression still carrying the tension of what had just occurred. "Sir," he said, "we are going to shut down this line for inspection. There was a system irregularity that could have caused serious issues if not addressed in time." Edward nodded once, his expression steady. "You caught it," the man added, glancing briefly toward Nia, not fully understanding, but aware something unusual had happened. Edward followed that glance, then shook his head slightly. "She did," he said. The man looked at Nia, surprised, but before he could say anything else, his radio crackled again and he stepped back, returning to his duties. The platform began to move again, slowly, cautiously, people gathering their belongings, adjusting their plans, but no one rushed. No one pushed forward toward the train. The memory of what had just happened lingered in their movements, in their pace, in the way they looked at things just a little longer than before. Edward turned back to Nia, his attention fully on her now. "Where are your parents?" he asked gently. Nia's gaze dropped for a moment, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of her sleeve. "It is just me and my aunt now," she said quietly. Edward nodded, not pressing further, not needing to. The answer carried enough weight on its own. He crouched slightly then, lowering himself to her level, not as a gesture of authority, but of respect, of meeting her where she stood. "You did something most people would not have done," he said. Nia looked at him, her eyes steady, not searching for approval, not expecting anything in return. I just remembered what it felt like when no one listened, she said. Edward felt that settle into him deeper than anything else had, the quiet truth behind everything that had unfolded. He stood back up slowly, his posture different now, less rigid, more grounded. The station lights reflected off the polished floor, softer now, warmer, the harsh flicker gone, replaced by a steady glow that made the space feel whole again. Nia took a small step back, then another, her movement gentle, unhurried, as if she knew her part in this moment was complete. Edward watched her, not stopping her, not calling her back, just observing the quiet way she moved, blending back into the world she had stepped out of for just a moment. Nia, he said softly. She paused, turning slightly. Yes? She replied. Edward held her gaze for a second, searching for the right words, then letting go of the need to make them perfect. Thank you, he said. Nia gave a small nod, not smiling, not dramatic, just acknowledging it, then turned and walked away, her small figure moving through the crowd until she was no longer distinct, just another presence among many. Edward remained where he was for a moment longer, watching the space she had left behind, the quiet ripple of change that still lingered in the air. The train stood silent, the platform calm, the system restored, but not the same. And as he finally turned to leave, stepping away from the place he had almost walked into without question, Edward Hale understood something that would stay with him far longer than the moment itself, that power was not always in control or command. Sometimes it was in the courage to speak, and sometimes it was in the humility to listen, and that was what had changed everything.